Joining us today on Tech Beyond Gender is Kat Weber, co-founder and CEO of LiveRim and ResolvePay. Kat is on a mission to give leaders confidence in pay conversations, making complex topics like remuneration, payroll, and compliance simple and actionable. Through her platforms, she helps organizations tackle pay inequities, salary benchmarking, and Holidays Act compliance, all in real time. Today, she's here to share her insights on why pay gaps still exist in tech and what we can do to close them. To start us off, could you share a bit about your journey, Kat? What led you to co-found LiveRim and ResolvePay? Thanks for joining us, by the way.
Thank you very much for having me. And I always feel very humbled when someone else introduces me. So thank you. That was a lovely introduction. Um, I guess my journey started over 10 years ago now. I was working in a large global consulting company in risk and compliance. And there was a couple of kind of key moments that I had. One was that we worked on a lot of the Holidays Act remediation work for big corporations around New Zealand. And I saw an opportunity there that we could automate that as a process, which wasn't really the model and isn't really the model of a lot of those kind of big consulting companies. So that was one thing that kind of happened. The second part of that, though, was that I really looked around at the leaders in the organization, of which, there were some brilliant people, but there was kind of no one I really wanted to grow up and be. And I think we'll probably talk about this a little bit throughout this conversation, but I think it's really hard to be what you can't see. And so at that time, I decided, that wasn't the right environment for me to continue working in, and I left. And over a couple of years after that, I thought, well, what do I really want to do, and how can I really make a difference to not just the big end of town kind of businesses, which I had a lot of experience working in, but small and medium businesses, which is like really a passion of mine, is how do we actually provide exceptional services and support to all companies, not just the big end of town with big budgets. So ResolvePay, kind of the idea for that came out of my background in risk and compliance. And I am not technical whatsoever. Like I actually failed a development course at university, so that's not my skill set, but I've managed to develop, I guess, an ability to work with very technical people and translate outcomes for customers that really make a big difference for them. So I wrote this algorithm basically of compliance for the Holidays Act and putting it into code. And then I had to find a developer to build it. At the time, I was contracting to a government agency, and Jonathan, my now co-founder, was also working there at the same time as me. And I actually begged him, I think, every day for 6 months to build this tool for me. Well, first of all, it was to find someone who could do it, which he did try and do. And then that didn't work out. And so he actually built it for me. And that's really where ResolvePay was initially born. And at the conclusion of him building the original tool, I gave him 50% of the company because actually it was the right thing to do, and I really wanted him to be a partner in it. We did ResolvePay for a number of years, and we started by helping small companies with their understanding their compliance to the Holidays Act and then remediating for them. For people who don't know what that is, it's basically helping companies understand how to pay their employees when they take leave, and when they get that wrong, fixing it for them. We now, though, not only help small companies and charities and iwi organisations, but we also help, government, and we help large NZX listed companies as well. So we've really kind of focused on a niche of that Holidays Act compliance and grown that out. We then realised, though, that at some point in time, ResolvePay shouldn't exist. The Holidays Act should and will likely be fixed to a point where we actually won't have an organisation anymore, which is a great outcome for us and for our customers. But we really like working together, Jonathan and I, and so we thought, well, what can we do with all this knowledge that we've built in payroll and compliance and help more companies? So we initially had an idea that we could help companies predict their workplace bias. So if there were biases in their payroll data, we would be able to figure it out and tell them. And so we went out and spoke to a whole bunch of different people, HR and the like, all around New Zealand and actually internationally as well, going, hey, what do you think of this? And would you buy it? And the kind of resounding feedback was, it's interesting. I probably wouldn't pay for it. And actually, I don't really want to know some of the time. And so we thought, okay, that's probably not something that people would buy. So what would you buy? And what, what's a problem for you with your payroll or HR data? And we refined it down to this need for real-time pay information or salary benchmarking. And that's where LiveRim came from. We actually co-designed that with a number of different HR professionals who then 80% of which have gone on to become customers. And yeah, now we're building out a data set across New Zealand and Australia and really Asia Pacific as well, that not only provides real-time benchmarking, but also can do all sorts of other kind of analysis around things like gender pay gap or other pay gaps, turnover analysis, and things like that.
What does a live salary benchmarking mean for someone like me who's not a customer of LiveRim? So I'm not paying for your services.
Yeah.
Is that a service which I can use as a user or like someone in tech?
So it's really a business product. So we help companies know what to pay their employees based on the market rate. So you might find a free source like like Seek has a guide, or many recruiters have salary guides that say, hey, here's what the market rate for these roles are. Where we are different is we take real payroll and HR data. We connect by API to our customers' payroll and HR systems, pull that data through, aggregate it and anonymize it, and then create a benchmark. So what that means is we would take a whole organization's data and anonymize it, and then say, right, now you have, say, software engineers, and 50 of our other customers also have software engineers. We create a bell curve of what the value of that role is, and then we present that back to them and say, okay, well, on average, a software engineer is worth X. So that when a company comes to pay reviews or is hiring new staff or is wanting to promote someone, they can go in and sense check what other people are actually paying in the market for those roles. So it helps guide their people budget, it helps guide their strategy around promotion and performance, and hiring as well.
Okay. You know what? This conversation just reminds me of a completely different conversation I was having with someone about AI, specifically with Sarah Mitchell, right? We were talking about AI and we were saying that some of the AI models can be so biased because if you just search for a software engineer or a security consultant, a picture of it, like you will just see a standard white male guy, right?
Yeah.
So it's just the information that goes in that comes out, literally. But
That's
then
it.
I'm thinking about the benchmarking that you're creating, right? Like, so if you're using the existing current data set from organizations on what they're paying, say if there is already a bias towards different genders, especially within tech, wouldn't that be reflected in your benchmarking as well?
So you can filter it down into different genders, and to location, and to industry, and all sorts of things. But I mean, in short, yes, it does reflect in the benchmark, but I guess there's a couple of points with that. So the first part that you touched on, using AI to search for a role. I actually did a test on this yesterday out of my own kind of curiosity. And I searched what a senior software engineer should be paid in Auckland in ChatGPT. And it gave me a range, and I said, you must have reference sources. It gave me a range from 6 different sources, from $112,000 a year to $154,000 a year. That's a 47% difference. So as a company, if you were wanting to hire a senior software engineer, you could potentially be paying a massively different range. Like, how do you know if you're paying the right amount? What's right is kind of the answer I was trying to figure out. And a lot of those sources, so there's some recruiter sources, there was some like websites where employees would go in and enter their own salary. They all have the same challenge of it being effectively point in time. And so, or the user controls what they input. So there's that issue with like a trust of, is this actually the right amount or not? The difference with us is because we're pulling straight from payroll and HR systems, but typically most companies will integrate their payroll system. It is actually what they've been paid, not just what they were paid when they were hired, not just what they were paid 6 months ago, but what they're being paid today. And the bias point is interesting. I don't know if it is an issue in terms of the benchmark, because when we present it back, we are taking the whole market into consideration. So that's everyone who's in that role, whether they've been hired the last 3 months or hired 3 years ago and they're in that role. I don't know if it's an issue. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, not quite, because the reason I picked up with AI was it's more like the garbage which goes in comes out, right? Literally. So any information that you input is what you get as an output. So if you are using the existing payroll within an organization to set benchmarks using that current payroll, say if an organization already has some hidden biases with pay by gender or by ethnicity, that's going to be in there already, right? So when creating a benchmark of that data would mean that it may still have certain stuff which is not very clear for a benchmark, is what I thought.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I think I would challenge that by going back and saying, I have not seen any company that does not have a gap. Every single company has a gap. So at the end of the day, it's the benchmarks are not, you must pay this. This is a reflection of what the actual market is paying. You can't filter down and go, well, tell me what a Maori Pacific Island person who's female who works in a tech company in South Auckland is paid, and then use that to then inform that you can pay other people in that kind of similar context that amount of money. Like there's no way that the benchmark works from that perspective. It's more saying, okay, well, what is the actual reflection of the total market at the moment? What is comparable? And then use that to inform what your pay strategy is. Yes, there definitely will pull in some biases as part of that, but honestly, bias exists everywhere. So I'm not sure it would ever be a solvable problem.
Yeah. So, okay, so we'll move on from that, and I'll probably have more questions around it later.
Yeah.
How did you discover that niche, and what drove you to focus on areas like remuneration and compliance?
I actually started my very first role in my career was working in governance. And as part of that, I had exposure to a lot of boards and understanding, I guess, at quite an early stage in a young age, that risk and compliance is super important. And it's really something that everyone in an organization should understand and be responsible for. I know that's very ambitious to think that, but that was a lot of the companies that we worked with, is how they considered and thought about risk and compliance. And I really enjoyed it. I actually found particularly the audit part of it, internal audit, like I felt like I was almost like a detective going in and seeing what was going on. And I found that really weirdly thrilling, I guess. And then I like data. So falling into that kind of payroll space, I guess was just a natural progression from those earlier roles. But yeah, I think like I touched on a little bit before, is it is super complicated. And I think with the skill sets that I've managed to build over my career, helping to make that simple for those small and medium-sized companies who don't have huge budgets or maybe even knowledge or experience to kind of treat risk and compliance in the same way that large corporates do. I just saw that as an opportunity that we could help with that.
Cool. So now let's dive directly into the topic of pay inequities in tech. So from what you've seen, what are the common causes of pay gaps in tech sector, especially for women, gender diverse groups?
I think the number one thing I've seen is the failure to promote. So while individual roles may have like a slight pay gap, typically of less than 10% based on our data, companies as a whole in New Zealand, from what we can see, have a lot larger gaps. So on average in our data set, the gender pay gap is 18%. I think the Stats New Zealand latest gender pay gap is 8%, but a lot of that is driven by bias from having a lot of government data into that data set, whereas we're looking only at private sector. And typically what that basically means from an 18% point of view is that women typically take lower paying roles, and we see that right through from the time they start entering the workforce around age 18 to 22, the whole way through, and men typically take higher paying roles. So if you take the example of developers versus testers, developers earn more and they make up more of a talent pool in an organization. Testers earn less and they're more likely to be female. But from an education point of view, they actually pretty much have the same type of education. It's just that we see women typically going into a tester role versus men typically going into a developer role. And I'd say a lot of that is to just do with, first of all, unconscious bias, but second of all, that piece around it's really hard to be what you can't see. So if you're graduating university and you look around, you go, oh, all my friends are being testers. Why would I go work in a heavily male-dominated role, which is, a harder environment to work in when I can just go hang out with my friends and be a tester? I actually think that's, a very critical part. And then the second part is, okay, then you get into that path of you become a tester, and that promotion pathway to getting into senior leadership is hard, and also a lot of organizations have that unconscious bias of not promoting women for whatever reason.
What you said was quite interesting, because I was reading a paper on this specific aspect in HP in US. They just did an experiment where there was an internal role that was advertised, and it was made open to everyone, internal men and women. And there were women who applied for the role, and when they went for negotiating the pay, women sort of negotiated 30% less than what they were willing to offer. And I was talking to another man about this, and he mentioned to me, look, with guys, like you see more of us in those senior technical roles. So we hang out together a lot, talk to each other more. And when we are going for an interview, we sort of have an idea about what to ask for or what to expect. Whereas with women, you don't really see very many women in those senior technical roles. So they have very less opportunity to even know what that pay should be, right?
Yeah, and interestingly, I often have conversations with people in very senior roles saying to me, what should I be asking for? And when I say people, I should say women, because it's typically women. And there's, just a lot of, I think a lot of the time it's maybe confidence of not knowing who to ask or not knowing what to ask for. I think as women as well, there's been studies that suggest that women will apply for roles when they tick every single box that role job description has, whereas men will go, I can do 40% of that, and they'll just apply for it. So there's probably, and that's anecdotal, but there is, I think, I've seen that in my own kind of networks and friend groups as well, of the confidence to apply, knowing that you can do the role 100% versus having, taken the chance that maybe you can't do it all, but you'll just give it a crack anyway. Yeah.
So you mentioned that from your data, you can see like 18% pay gap, right?
Yeah.
Now,
that's for both on median gender pay gap and average gender pay gap.
Okay, so that's across all sector, right?
That's tech.
Oh, that's tech, 18% pay gap. Wow, that's actually massive. But I'm sure if you go to organizations and talk about this, that we have a gender pay gap, they would probably immediately say no. We make sure that our staff are well taken care of and things. Now, what do you think organizations should do to really understand this pay structures?
So in my experience, every single company has a gender pay gap. Every single one. Now, even we do at LiveRim. So we have for our average gender pay gap, it is, I just checked it this morning, and where is it? It's -2% on average. So it's in favor of women on average, but at the median, it's a 12% gap. So, and that's just because we have more men in senior roles. In terms of, back to your question around, that we don't have a pay gap, there's been a few different things here. First of all, I think if they say they don't have one, they typically don't know what a gender pay gap is. And so there's an education piece of like pay equity, paying people the same amount for the same role versus gender pay gap, are two different things. I've actually only heard of one company who have genuinely not got a gender pay gap, and that's because they pay every single one of their staff members the same amount. Except when I dug into this further, they pay their founder less. She's opted to pay herself less. So actually they do have a gender pay gap. But if you remove the founder and you just look at the employees, every single person is paid the same, and that's a decision that they've made as an organization to go, we're actually going to pay everyone the same while we're on this growth journey. Other than that, other companies have said to me, oh, we don't have a gender pay gap, I pay everyone the same. And then I say to them immediately, so how many women are on your leadership team? And more often than not, they've either got no women or very few women, majority men, on that team. The gender pay gap, I guess, tells you different things. From the median perspective, if you look at a large organization, they'll have a large amount of their employees being paid the same amount. So if you take retail as an example, you may have a lot of like minimum wage or close to workers, and they're all pretty much paid the same amount of money, and there's heaps of them. So on a median perspective, it would look like you've got no gap. But when you go to an average perspective, because you've got, this is very generalized, but your leadership team may have a lot more men on it than women, and so there after that, then you would potentially have more, or likely have a average pay gap that is larger. And then it kind of comes back to, men are more likely to be promoted into management positions, and so therefore typically every company that we've seen has some sort of gender pay gap.
That's interesting, right? So obviously in tech, it's going to be more pronounced because even in senior technical roles, you see more men. And as you mentioned at the start, like there are more women as maybe testers or even BAs or scrum masters who might be paid much lesser compared to an enterprise architect or a tech lead, right? So now, have you done any work to just look at those jobs specifically, like testers, for instance? Where is there a possibility that a male tester could be paid more than a female tester?
I actually searched a few roles before we started. I didn't search tester, but I've got some other data here for you. So interestingly, junior software engineers have a -7% gap. So that's in favor of women. They're paid higher than men in that role. But when you go into intermediate, it's 8% in favor of men.
Wow.
So it shifts. And I don't know why, but that's just what the data is showing us. Then you go into a principal or the next level up, and it's a 9% gap. So what my gut feeling on these are all median, by the way. My gut feeling on that is that's because less women are being promoted through. And I don't know like a lot of the time we hear this kind of anecdotal argument of being, oh, that's because of the pregnancy penalty and women leaving to have children. I can't see that in the data and it might still be true, but we see in our data, and I know Kernel Wealth, who is a KiwiSaver investment app, they recently did a post on this on LinkedIn as well. At every single stage, women are paid less or contributing less to KiwiSaver in New Zealand than men, and that indicates that women are taking lower paid roles the whole way through, or paid less the whole way through. Just back to our data, when you go to look at UX designers, there's a 20% gap. So men on a median basis are paid 20% higher than women in a UX designer role. If we go back to team leads, the median gap is 3%, but the average gap is 6%. And the only role I could find that had pretty much the same was data scientists. They're pretty much paid the same across all of our data set. Now, we've taken the median to give these examples because we are looking across different companies, and so they will have different pay philosophies and things like that. But ultimately, the reason, in my view, for all of these gaps is that, failure to promote women through. Women are choosing careers that are overall paid less than men. And I don't know if that's because there's this culture that we believe that that role has less value, and so therefore we should pay women less, or there's an unconscious bias around it.
What you just said was just it's a real eye opener, right? So this is something that we've been talking about a lot, but it's actually good to see that there is real data that's backing this up as well, especially like in general with what you have just said. Like there is definitely not just a gender pay gap, but also within the same roles there is pay inequity within the pay rules, right? Especially when you started talking about the junior software engineers and intermediate and principal engineers. This is something that we actually see within organizations, because I work in tech as well, and I see it very prominently, where organizations can have all good intentions and recruit and find a gender balance during the grad recruitment programs. But then as they go up in their career ladder, you see a drop of women moving into senior technical roles. And it is only men, and then women sort of levitate towards being a tester, being a BA, being a like platform owner, or a people manager, rather than move up in the senior technical roles. As you said, like maybe they're not getting much opportunities to move in that space within the technical roles. And as how you said, like you don't really see very many women there. So you might choose to actually stick to those traditional roles because you're like, okay, I see more of people like myself in those roles. It's a huge challenge as to how you strike a balance. What can you do, right?
Yeah, when I worked in I worked for NZTA for a while, and we brought on some grads. Oh, I think they were interns actually. And one of the really incredible young women that we had come and work for us for a summer was this is Pacifica actually. And she said to me, why don't I see anyone else who's Pacifica here? And I said, no one applied. And she reflected on that, and she said, to be honest, when I told my family that I was coming to work here, they all laughed at me and wondered why I wasn't going to get a job at Rebel Sport for summer. And, I'm on a mission to show my community and my family that, this is a great career, and we can have, a lot of impact in this space. And she was honestly one of the most amazing women I've ever worked with, and she's gone on to do really great things. But it really does take someone to be brave and also have an organization that's open to anyone who applies, to come and be a part of an environment and hopefully make real change. But I don't know. I mean, it's hard to start that, isn't it? Because like my response was, well, no one applied. Or maybe we should have been doing more to go and actually reach out to groups of people who might not typically feel confident to go and apply, or even be aware that there are roles to apply to.
Yeah. And also, like we're soon going to be publishing our latest research that we conducted. And even in that research, we sort of, what was highlighted was pay transparency, right? Like about 70% of women felt that the pay policies are not transparent within the organizations at all, right? What do you think organizations, especially in tech sector, should do to create that level of transparency where women or other minorities can make a confident choice or decision when it comes to their pay?
Pay transparency is a very interesting topic, and it's something I hear talked about a lot, and there's so many different views on it. I think the kind of knee-jerk reaction that people have when you start talking about pay transparency is, oh my God, you're going to share all of my payroll of all of my staff with everybody. And that is really scary. Now, there are some companies who are doing that. And, there's some interesting books on how that's worked and how that hasn't worked as well. But in my view, pay transparency doesn't have to be open book. It can be actually, first of all, sitting down and going, well, what is our pay philosophy? And how are we actually going to set parameters around what we pay people, and communicating that? Like, you don't actually have to even go to the extreme of like telling people what the bands are, although I think that's actually a really good thing to do, because it gives people guidance, and it also holds organizations accountable as well, of going, okay, well, we've set these bands and this is what these roles fit into. So there's clarity around that. But if that's even too far, just starting with having a really clear pay philosophy, this is what we're going to pay, this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to come to those numbers as well. We're going to use benchmarks, or we're going to set our own, I don't know, percentage increase every year, or whatever it is, what's right for that organization, and then communicate that with your staff. I honestly think the number one thing is just keeping it very clear so everybody's on the same page, and sticking to that philosophy as well. Like, I've worked in organizations that have said, oh, we have a pay band and your role is within, I don't know, say $80,000 to $100,000. But then I knew that there were people who were being paid, $120,000, and they're technically in that band. So and I'm not saying that bands is also the right thing to do, but if you are going to, say, for example, go with a philosophy around having pay bands and communicating those, then as an organization, commit to sticking to it and communicating with your staff as to why you do what you do.
Yeah, with the pay bands as well, right? Like the pay bands are quite wide. And you could just be in any range in that spectrum. And you can't really say that what you're being paid is fair in that band as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is probably a whole podcast in itself, the topic of different pay philosophies and how you come to develop a framework and, what works right in different contexts. I really like the idea of having skills-based value. So quantifying the value of an individual skill, that's hard to do. To my knowledge, no one's doing that. But that's like, for me, that's kind of utopia if we could go, well, here's what makes up a role and here's an individual value for that. I think though, coming back to your original question, communication with staff on why you do what you do and how you do it, and if it changes as well, that's a way that you can empower women or any minorities in an organization to really understand where they sit and what their value is, and then how they can increase their value over time if they want to go and get trained, if they want to be promoted into a different role, like giving them that real clear pathway.
Like again, in the latest research where we were going to be publishing soon, we also found something more interesting. Like 70% of women said that it's not transparent. And a lot of women have also said that they are not comfortable to have discussions with their managers regarding the pay gap, possible pay gap, or even suspicious pay gap because of the fear of repercussions that they could face if they have that conversation.
Yeah, I find this really frustrating because that kind of indicates to me that that organization doesn't have a culture of safety around any type of conversation. But pay is also a really hard conversation for people to have, because that's then attributing a value or worth to you. So it becomes very personal, right? I also think in New Zealand, we have a really interesting culture around talking about money in general. And I don't know where that comes from, but I kind of look at my own parents and grandparents, and like it's very taboo to talk about money and very taboo to ask any detail around how much people earn. And, so I think there is like a lot of culture around that, whereas other parts of the world, I think, are a lot more open around that. So that's probably one part. And then the second part is, the confidence that women have and that value. And then there's probably that piece around, like you touched on earlier, is just not knowing where you should be sitting. So how can you confidently go and have a conversation around justifying your contribution to an organization if you're not confident that you even know what that is? Having said that, in my experience, women have negotiated with me on rates far more than men ever have. So I don't think there's a lack of confidence in terms of, if they do feel like they're worth more, then they will negotiate on that. But, to your point, it's that, in the first instance, do you even have the confidence to know, or the data to know, what it is that you should be arguing for?
Yeah. So now, what are some myths or misconceptions you've encountered when it comes to salary benchmarking and pay equity?
Okay, so the first one that we often talk about, and we discovered when we were first kind of coming up with this LiveRim concept, is that salary surveys that are put out by big consulting companies or recruiters or whoever are point in time. So say I'm running a point in time salary survey, I today will go out and I'll probably spend 3 months canvassing a whole lot of organizations and asking them how much they pay different roles. I pull that all together. There's some companies who run these will do an evaluation model. So they'll say, okay, well, a software engineer here is actually equivalent to an intermediate developer or whatever, and they'll do some comparison. Others will just do it off job title and a whole range in between. And then they'll spend 3 to 6 months pulling that together, and then they'll publish a report. And then they won't publish another report for 12 months. So when the report is published, at best, it's kind of 3 to 6 months out of date. At worst, it's 18 months out of date. Just, the lag time between. So yes, it's a good source of one point of data, but it isn't necessarily reflective of the market today. The second part to that is when we did all of our market research, when we were designing LiveRim, we spoke to a whole lot of recruiters, and almost every single one of them told us that if they didn't have a complete data set, so say they didn't have data on an intermediate software developer, they would just guess. And I don't think that's true for every single role, but we have been told by at least 6 different recruiters who publish reports that they do just make up some data. Now, it would be an informed kind of makeup of data, as in, they might look at what their most recent placement of that role was 6 months ago. They might call a couple of companies up, but it isn't actual real data of what the market is. And then I think the third piece, which we touched on a little bit before, is this kind of misconception that companies pay fairly because they have pay bands. I think you can also make a pay band work for you to suit whatever agenda that you have as well. So yeah, I guess we've got some ideas, not that we are experts in this by any stretch, but around how you can kind of reduce some of your unconscious bias in your hiring process and your kind of review processes as well. By having, for example, set questions that you ask someone that you're interviewing or someone that you're looking to promote, and before you even go into the conversation, agreeing what the answers should be.
Oh, so this is quite interesting, right? And also, whatever you've just mentioned also highlights the cultural aspect where we don't traditionally speak about the pay bands, the pay transparencies and stuff. So obviously, a leader in an organization will have that nervousness, right? How am I going to talk about this? How am I going to start this conversation? How am I going to actually change the culture within the organization so it's okay to have these conversations? So what tips will you give leaders who are nervous or unsure about navigating these conversations?
I think the first thing is using data to drive the conversation is really important. So it doesn't just have to be one source of data. Like you could use LiveRim, obviously, shameless plug, but also you could use multiple different sources and inform that into your own structure of here's our philosophy that why we're paying what we're paying. Here's the data that we've got to back up why that is a valid amount for that role, and then share that with your staff. I always think being proactive is a really great way to be rather than reactive. And so having those regular reviews, looking if someone's upskilling and actually, providing them with the pay for the value that they're creating in the organization. I think going back to transparency, practicing transparency at the right level for your organization and the culture of your organization. So you don't have to share every salary, but be clear about your frameworks, and those will help you build trust with your staff. Everyone just wants to know where they stand. So as long as you have a framework that you can be super clear on, that's going to really help reduce the nervousness around those conversations. And then I think the last part I would add would be around being really confident in those discussions and not defensive. And it is a two-way street ultimately of going, well, here's what we're doing and here's how it works. Maybe doing some consultation on how you set up that framework, so that people feel like they've got input into that. I mean, obviously everyone would love to set their own pay, but there's a limited money that every company has that they're going to want to have to spend on salaries. But I mean, I'm a very collaborative type of person, and that's how we've set up both LiveRim and ResolvePay. Our approach with pay transparency is we don't openly share what we pay, but if someone comes to us and says in our team, hey, I want to know what a UX designer gets paid, then we'll share what that rate is. But we don't publish it, but we just approach it for us. we'll tell you. And we also will tell people what we pay ourselves as well.
Awesome. So, in your experience, what is the impact on employee engagement and trust when companies proactively address pay equity and compliance?
Well, I think the number one piece around why this is important and the impact on that is actually, it comes down to making sure you've got the biggest possible talent pool that you can pull on. So not just your current employees, but your prospective employees. If you decide to really focus on pay equity and to be very open to who applies and very open to who you want to consider bringing through from a talent pool perspective, and the bigger that talent pool is, the more likely you are to get the best person for the job, regardless of gender. And I know I was talking to quite a large manufacturing company recently, and they know they have a gender pay gap problem. And the number one reason why they're fixing it is because they also have a massive shortage of talent for this very specialist type of manufacturing that they do. If they don't address that problem, they literally won't have enough people to do the work. So it actually just comes down to like good business. From an employee engagement and trust perspective, I think that if people feel like you are prioritizing having a big talent pool and also the best person for the job and really focused on giving everyone opportunity to participate, there's going to be higher retention and loyalty to that brand, because, you know, people want to be involved in something that, well, I think people want to be involved in something where when they trust what their company or their employer is doing. And then you kind of go down to like people who feel valued, more engaged. So you're going to have a more productive workforce when you've got higher engagement, and that kind of strong employer brand, you know, companies that are known for pay transparency, companies that are known for providing opportunities regardless of what the person looks like or identifies as or whatever, and they do attract, you know, really top talent. And I think the other piece, actually, just adding to that, which just popped into my head now, is from a company perspective, if you have a team who looks the same, they will think one way and they will provide a service or product that, you know, is probably ideal for the customer that looks like them. In reality, most companies will have very diverse customers. So if you have diversity in your team, then you're going to have better thought and design and process and outcomes ultimately. So you're going to build better outcomes for your customers and better products and services for your customers, which is ultimately going to make you a better company.
Yeah, very interesting, especially with regards to the talent pool, right? I often hear this conversation, especially in tech, within specific niche tech areas, where they say, oh, there's a shortage of talent pool. But that's surprising. And you also mentioned something very interesting at the start, where between the developers and testers, like male or female, they begin to have the same level of education. Their educational background is very similar. But then one gender pool gets directed to one certain type of roles where they get paid less. There are less opportunities into senior technical roles. But they have so much potential because they have the same level of education. They can do it because they have proved it in their past through their education, right? But because we fail to recognize that talent pool and give them the opportunities, which also you mentioned that women are not given enough opportunities, we are creating that shortage of talent pool unconsciously. Whereas we have the talent within the country, there is no need for us to look for talents outside of the country as well. So we are actually just negating that 50% of talent pool which is like really untapped resource within the country, right?
Yeah, honestly, in my own personal experience, I never considered going into tech, ever. At school, I went to a career consultant, and she said to me I should become a plumber. And honestly, I probably should have been. I would have made way more money by now. But I was like, I don't know any female plumbers. I'm not going to be a plumber. And then at university, I did a business degree, and no one ever suggested to me that tech was an option. And then I worked in governance and I worked in consulting and I did all these things. And it was never something that was ever across my radar. And I see that now when I go, I spend, a bit of times doing work in schools, particularly intermediate and kind of secondary school, around what it is like to be a woman who works in tech and leads tech companies, even though I'm not a technical person. And I always ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you don't have to know the answer, but what do you want to be? And hardly anyone ever says they want to work in tech. And I just don't think it's something that we talk about enough as an option for our young people to even understand that that's something that they could do. A lot of the people that I know who work in tech now have had parents who have helped facilitate that conversation, or they like video games and they've just like naturally evolved through, like when I was younger and playing The Sims or whatever on their computer, and then it's kind of graduated and they've become developers. So I definitely think there's an opportunity to really get in at a lower level and champion tech as a really great sector.
Yeah, I just want to also add, I was having a conversation with another friend. She is so intelligent. She works in tech. She's in a very senior tech role. And her 12-year-old daughter told her that coding is for boys and not for girls. So it's like there is some sort of conditioning, even though her mom is into technology sector, like in a senior technical role. There is this some sort of conditioning at school or in society or something that she sees that reinforces to her that coding is for boys and it's not for girls at school.
You know what's interesting about that as well is I read something that actually said when coding first started, years and years ago, the majority of coders were actually women.
Exactly, yeah.
And then it shifted. Yeah, I mean, my daughter's only 5, but I do have this conversation with her. She's an amazing artist and she wants to be an artist when she grows up, and I'm all for that. But I do explain to her that that's a hard career to have, and perhaps we could channel that art into something else. My husband's sitting there going, she's 5 years old, like lay off her a little bit. But I know someone else whose daughter is a lot older and she's just about to finish secondary school, and she's followed a similar path and very passionate about art. And her mum's channeled her into product design. And so now she has both her passion of being an artist and something that she can, take into a really great career and make a really great life for herself as well. So it's having that ability to, I guess, connect your passion. And I don't know, I love the tech sector. So I'd be really happy if my kids ended up working in the tech sector as well. But yeah, it's hard to know what to do when your parents maybe don't, or the people that are in your community don't have that experience of knowing what the opportunities are.
So what unique pay equity challenges do women, especially women of color or migrant women, face in tech sector?
So I think the unconscious bias in hiring and promotions is probably the number one challenge that I would see. One of the ways, one example of this, GitHub did a study, and basically what they did is they got men and women to do some coding, and then it was reviewed. The code review process was undertaken. Women coders performed better than men in code reviews, but only when it was a blind review. So if the reviewer didn't know that it was a woman coder versus a male coder, the women, almost every single time, their code was just reviewed and approved. However, when the gender was known, women performed worse, which means that there must be some unconscious bias in that space. one of the ways that we always suggest companies kind of can tackle this and champion equitable pay practices in their organization is interviewing equal men and women for every single role. So if you've got a role, make an effort to interview 2 men and 2 women. And there's actually a Harvard Business Review study on this. So the study looked at what the likelihood of someone being placed for a role was based on their gender. If 1 woman is interviewed and 3 men are interviewed for a role, there's a 90% chance that a man will be hired. On the reverse, if 3 women are interviewed and 1 man, there's a 25% chance a man will be hired. If 2 women and 2 men are interviewed, there's a 50% chance that either one of them will be hired. So there is a really strong unconscious bias that people have. And I think it goes back to that point I made before around standardize your questions, standardize your process, but most importantly, know what the right answers are before you even go into the interview, because then that removes that conscious and unconscious bias from your process, whether that's for new hires or for promotions as well. I think we're also still dealing a lot with this kind of, oh, she doesn't look like a leader or she doesn't feel like a leader. And because, you know, tech is predominantly male dominated, there is an expectation that leaders, you know, look a certain way or act in a certain way. That's pretty generalized, actually, probably beyond tech as well. But it is hard to be what you can't see. So if you see a leadership team and there's 1 woman and 6 men on it, I don't know, subconsciously I would sit there and go, well, how would I even fit into that? And that's, you have to be super brave to go, I'm going to just push. So, and I've worked with some incredible female leaders who have done that, and they have pushed through those barriers, and they've been brave and you know, dealt with a lot of challenges of working in an environment that is not built for them. There's a really good video I watched the other day, actually, on International Women's Day. I think it's an old one, and it was the kind of the flipping of the script of what it was like to be a woman in a workplace versus a man. And basically it was this man working in this female dominated workspace, and he's sitting in a meeting, and this woman comes over and is like, oh, you'll get the coffee, doll, won't you? And you know, that kind of thing. And you're sitting there and you're like, oh my God, I can relate to every single one of these as an example. But I've showed it to a few people, and they laugh, and then they're like, oh my God, that's so true.
Yeah, exactly right. In a male-dominated sector, we do see it where it's just assumed that a woman will probably take the minutes or summarize the meetings or be a scrum master. It's just a blind assumption.
Yeah, or organize the birthday cards, or, you know, sort out the morning tea, or, you know, whatever it is. And I don't think that's true for every workplace, but I'll send you the video. I could relate to every single point that was made in it. And they even go out for after work drinks afterwards, and walking home with like keys between your hands, or not feeling safe to walk through a park. And all of those things, again, contribute back into the workforce, because, you know, I read something the other day that Henry Ford designed the 9 to 5. And they designed that to suit males' performance throughout the day. So men work best in the morning, and then by the afternoon and the evening, they get tired. That was his idea of why he set up the 9 to 5. But, you know, for women, we have a lot of different things that we have to juggle, and we have family commitments, and I actually work best at night, to be honest, rather than the morning. And so everything is set up for men to succeed. And now we are having, you know, women are having to adjust to fit into that world. And so, you know, we finish work at 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and in winter it's dark and you're having to walk home and you don't feel safe. Well, I've definitely had experiences of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just completely agree. So it's not just the time, I think the whole culture, the environment, the way you need to speak in a meeting, for instance, or the way you need to convince someone about your product or your work. is all set up for a specific group of people. And then in the recent years, more women have turned up into those sectors where they just are expected to mold into that environment seamlessly.
Yeah, I think, to kind of play devil's advocate now, in my experience, the most supportive people that I've worked with have actually been men. So there are definitely a lot of men who are extremely supportive and really do want the best for all of their colleagues, not just their female or just their male colleagues. But I do think there is like a generalized culture as a whole, and it's not just New Zealand, it's globally, and that's set up from, 100 years of the way that we set up this kind of modern workforce.
Absolutely. I do completely agree with male allies. Like we have someone who edits the podcast very religiously, who's a male guy. And I've seen many male allies who have actually supported me throughout in this journey as well with Tech Beyond Gender. Now, have you seen examples where addressing pay inequities has led to better retention and inclusion outcomes for especially underrepresented groups in tech?
So I think the best example that I've got of this is actually borrowed from Jonathan, who's my co-founder. And so when he worked at his previous company, which was a tech company, he was the chief technology officer there. He implemented this 50% rule around interviewing. So I have to interview equal number of male and women for every single role. If you don't have one of those genders represented, you need to go out and find them and make sure that they are included in that potential talent pool. When they implemented that, as well as doing the questions and the answers, the result was that 60% of the team leads were women, and they had a 50% male-female workforce, despite women only making up 30% of tech. So those were for technical roles, and what it actually, did is really change the culture of that organization to be exceptionally high performing, and having, really diverse conversations and great ideas around solutions because there was diversity in the team. In LiveRim's data, I would say it's probably too early to say around, is there being an impact on retention if companies know what the gender pay gap is and then make changes. And the other piece to that is, we present what someone's gender pay gap is, but we don't actually know why or what they're doing internally with their processes to address that, if they are at all.
Yeah. What advice would you give to women or minorities in tech who feel they are underpaid or undervalued but don't know how to approach this topic?
I think have conversations. Like, go and talk to your network, have coffees, talk to your friends, reach out. I spend a lot of time having coffees with mostly women, but men as well, around, what I see happening in the market, or helping connect them to people who might be able to help them on that journey. In my experience, most people want to help and most people will have a coffee. So if you feel undervalued or you feel like you aren't being paid what you're worth, but you don't know for sure, if you're not confident in asking your own company, go and talk to other people. People genuinely do want to help, in my experience.
Cool. Finally, if our listeners want to learn more about pay equity or engage with LiveRim and ResolvePay, where should they start?
Probably just head to our website, so liverim.com or resolvepay.co.nz. We've got a lot of information on there, and then we do have a free gender pay gap reporting tool, so any company can sign up and have an always-on view of what their gender pay gap is, and there's a lot of analysis there around, historic pay gap and trends, how that sits across your organization from different pay bands or percentiles, and that kind of extra level of detail. So, okay, 18% pay gap, is that good or bad? Benchmark that against the market, and then hopefully start to really give companies enough information and detail to start making some change.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Kat. It was amazing having this conversation, and it's so good and reassuring for some of us who are thinking and suspecting that something could not be quite right, but to actually see evidence to support that is always quite good. It's good in a way that it says that there is a problem that we need to address. It's not good that there is a problem, but at least we know it's good to actually acknowledge. That's the first step, I assume, before we could make any real change. Thank you
Yeah,
so.
you're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. And I guess the parting thing I would have for anyone who's feeling nervous if they do have a gender pay gap, I actually think it's okay to know that you have a gender pay gap. It's then what you do from there. So don't be scared, even if it's big. You know, we have some companies that have over 30% gender pay gap in our data set. And I mean, I actually think that's okay. It's then what do you do after it? So if you're addressing it, then that's great.